Hello, everyone, and so happy new year, and so welcome back to the new semester and this semester's CFPR seminar series. As you may already checked online, we have like a very wonderful lineup of talks on a variety of topics and social context. And so we sincerely welcome and appreciate your continued support and participation throughout the semester. And so today, I'm very honored to introduce our very first speaker, Professor Ron Lasaga. And actually, I think this introduction may not be necessary to many of us, right? Because we have already read and learned Professor Lasaga's works in classes on family and demography, and in various forms of PhD qualifying and preliminary exams, and also for our own research projects. But I still do my duty, I guess. And so Professor Lasaga is Emeritus Professor of Demography and Social Science Research Methods at the Free University of Brussels. He's a member of the Royal Academy in Brussels, a founding member of the Dutch Academy and the American Philosophical Society, and an international member of the US National Academy of Sciences. His works cover a myriad of demographic changes, including fertility transitions in Europe, the demography of sub-Saharan African marriage and fertility patterns, the Muslim minorities in Europe, more formal demographic modeling of fertility postponement and recuperation, among others, of course. And so almost 40 years ago, Professor Lasaga insightfully proposed the framework of the second demographic transition, which has been one of the most powerful theoretical and empirical frameworks to explain the family and the demographic changes in Europe, in the US, and Latin America, and of course, like in Asia, including Singapore, for the past decades until now. And so without further ado, let's welcome Professor Lasaga to present on the topic, the second demographic transition, origin, theory, facts with special reference to Asian cases. And so we will follow the CFPR convention that we'll let Professor Lasaga to finish his talk in about 1 hour, and then we'll follow up by a 30 minutes Q&A. And so Professor, you may now share your screen, and the time is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, good afternoon to all the persons there at the Institute in Singapore. And now I will be sharing my slides. Just a second.
Sure.
I would like to start out with a short introduction into the difference between the first and the second demographic transitions. As this is not necessarily clear to everybody. Most of the students, of course, in Singapore, this will be a superfluous introduction. But the first demographic transition typically refers to the historical declines in mortality and fertility, and the end point was supposed to be a stationary population with fertility closely around the replacement level with some oscillations. And also on the sociological side, as suggested by William Good in the United States, there will be a growing dominance over the entire world of the nuclear conjugal family, as it was known in the West. But of course, none of these things materialized, especially not the stable fertility at replacement level, or the nuclear conjugal family, and the stationary population is only a reference model, which was not at all materializing. Instead, we have new endpoints. We have systemic sub-replacement fertility. That means that for a very, very long time, fertility is remaining below the level of 2 children, and sometimes can go quite deeply, even below 1.5 children as a total fertility rate, even for cohorts. And then in addition, and this is crucial, of course, that is that there is a vast postponement transition occurring. And that materializes in a postponement of marriage and even a decline of marriage. Not necessarily dramatically so, but a postponement of marriage, that's a very clear indicator. With that, a postponement of parenthood. There will be also much more divorce. And in fact, in the West, this was the first indicator that something was happening, an indicator starting already clearly in the 50s, that there was more to come. And then, of course, later on, during the 60s and the 70s, there was a rise in premarital cohabitation, but also in postmarital cohabitation. That is, after widowhood or after divorce, wouldn't be no remarriage, but instead cohabitation. A postponement of marriage also and of cohabitation also leads to more singlehood. And if fertility among cohabitants is permitted, then, and there's a divorce or the cohabitation is ended, then of course you have more monoparental family households, typically headed by women. And subsequent to divorces and new cohabitation of new remarriage, you have more reconstituted families as well. But very low fertility also means extra aging and a population decline, unless it is, of course, compensated by immigration, as it is now in much of Western Europe. But if there is no migration, you have the negative population growth momentum, which is starting to operate. And that's a crucial phenomenon because it's not easily stopped. Just like the positive growth momentum, it is dependent on changes in the age structure, but now in this case, not caused by rapidly growing or by high fertility, but now by very low fertility. And even if you want to restore a stationary population, that is with a growth rate of 0, after, let's say, 20, 30 years of subreplacement fertility, of very low subreplacement fertility, you would need something like half a decade of 2 children in order to stop the decline. This is why it's called a momentum. Once the decline starts, it's extremely difficult to stop. And this is very often forgotten in the whole debate. But okay, that is not the topic of this presentation. We'll focus on that second demographic transition instead. So the proposition then of the 1986 was by me and Dirk van der Kaar, my Dutch colleague, and we were supposed to write an article for the Dutch Journal of Sociology. At the end of the article, we didn't have a title. And so in an unguarded moment, I said, well, why don't we call it, is there a second demographic transition? Question mark. But then Dirk wrote another article in the year thereafter, in English, this time not in Dutch, and the question mark had gone. And as a result, the notion of a second demographic transition was launched. The inspiration for it came from a variety of sources. One was the French historian Philippe Ariès, who wrote a fantastic book about the history of childhood, going back to the early Middle Ages, reconstituting the position of children because they were not necessarily viewed as full persons. That came much later on in the 19th and especially in the 20th century. And that's why Ariès calls it the period of l'enfant roi. People invest a lot of their resources, time, money, into the proper education of their children. And that is probably also one of the main reasons why there was a fertility transition as part of that first demographic transition. But now there is an end of the enfant roi. And instead, it's now the couple and its self-realization that comes to the fore. And only when that is being achieved, and that takes time, and that means postponement, only then would be what the couple consider having children. Then, of course, the child would still be at the apex of their concerns. But it would take a long time, a longer time, because the couple and its realization for a while are at the apex of the ranking. And that's more or less echoing what Abraham Maslow said in his theory already in the 1940s. That is, when populations get richer, there is a succession of needs. from material needs, security, adequate income, to non-material needs. And that is self-realization, emancipation, and individual autonomy, meaning that individuals will choose for themselves and they will no longer be pressed by family or other agents in their environment. And at the apex of that pyramid of Maslow is, of course, recognition. That is, that we would seek to some degree recognition in what we do professionally for others, for other family members, that will be recognized as valuable. That is, of course, then the Maslowian aspect that is operating. But then, of course, both Dirk van der Ka and I lived through a troublesome period, the revolutionary 60s in the West, and that was characterized by secularization in the first place. That is, both the Catholic and the Protestant churches had dwindling memberships. No Sunday Mass or Sunday services were attended anymore. Fewer and fewer marriages were celebrated with a religious service. So that is a dramatic secularization which continues all the way through till today. We are now extremely secularized societies with only minorities of religious people. It's slightly more slowly in the United States, but now that secularization is also really in full swing in the US as well. There were also declines in all traditional forms of authority. That is, the teacher and the professor were no longer the gods in class. The politicians would need to be much more careful in what they say. They would no longer have that absolute authority. There was, of course, and that is very crucial for demography, a contraceptive and the sexual revolution. Women would not be scared anymore of having, or not to the same extent at least, of having a unplanned pregnancy. But also, and that is also a major element in the game, that is the rise of female education, along with the rise of male education as well. I mean, let's not forget it. I mean, everybody's education rose dramatically in Europe during the 1960s. And that, of course, resulted in political awareness in the public, which was much more acute. And that resulted in public protests, particularly by the younger generation in the US, in tandem with the Vietnam War, in France against de Gaulle. It was the end of the dictatorships in Spain and in Portugal. And you can really see that everything was in the works. And then last but not least, and that is, of course, what Ron Engelhardt is referring to, a rise in other elements in the political agenda with the green aspects coming to the fore, and the awakening of the ecological concerns also starting, even, you know, at that time still to a minor degree, but the roots of the ecological awareness is to be situated in that period and among these young generations as well. Okay, so what were the expectations then for the second demographic transition? Well, it would spread as a result of structural features, the ones I've just outlined: rising education of men and women, rising employment in the tertiary sector, together with much more professional orientations, rising real household income. These were the typical structural phenomena that would be supportive of the SDG in other areas than Europe. And it would, in tandem with that, there would be cultural evolutions, again, the ones I've mentioned, the emancipation trends, particularly with respect to the gender revolutions, but not only with that, also with respect to sexual minorities. There would be an ethics revolution. People would regard suicide, homosexuality, divorce, in non-absolute manner anymore. They would say, well, it depends on circumstances, or we can understand it given this, that, and the other. Abortion would be also an element in the debate there. And there would be a rise in individual autonomy and the freedom of choice, and of course, a further secularization. That would be expectation that number one, that could be formulated already from the 1990s onward. Expectation number two, that is that populations, and that could be also subgroups in the population, of course, or regions, that they would follow similar trends in the rising aspects of the SDT, but there would be no convergence to a unique endpoint or a unique configuration. So there is room, of course, for diversity, and quite a bit of room for diversity in the evolution. And the reason is typical. It's also the reason why there was such diversity during the first demographic transition with respect to the fertility decline. That is that there is a strong historical path dependency, and it depends on social organization of societies. And the current developments will result in both structural and in difference in the weight of the structural and the cultural determinants. Not all of these would have exactly the same weight. So there would not only be heterogeneity with respect to the dependent variables, but also heterogeneity with respect to the conditioning variables. And the result, of course, is a great unfolding of patterns on a global scale. So that was expectation number two. The developments. Well, the initial reaction was the reaction typically in Europe in the 1990s. That is, not us, we are different, we're not Western Europeans, we're not little Scandinavians, and it's only a Northern and a Western European idiosyncrasy. That was even presented that way by a famous English colleague in 2000. Until that late, there was opposition to the notion of a second demographic transition, although it was very clear that also in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe, the phenomena were coming to the surface. And also then we noticed that selected, but I mean selected is the word selected should be stressed, that selected SDT characteristics were spreading in the Americas and in several Asian populations, including China and Japan, as we will show later on. But there was one big difference compared to the West. That is, in the West, as I said before, divorce was a precursor indicator. But then all the others came more or less at the same time. That is, marriage and parenthood postponement and the rise of cohabitation or all the other alternative forms of partnership. That was a synchronized or fairly synchronized bunch of events. And that was only a Western phenomenon, typical for the regions with a tradition of nuclear and conjugal families. But for the rest, outside Europe and Northern America, there would be only partial SDT patterns to be observed, and the contextual variations would, of course, be of paramount importance. Well, let's now look at the grand scale of these contextual differences. And the first one, and it's of course directly relevant to this talk here, are the Far East patriarchal societies. And here you see that sub-replacement fertility precedes by a long haul, by several decades actually, the rise in cohabitation. And there is still no fertility or very little fertility outside marriage. In Japan, cohabitation starts in the lower classes, but in China, it starts in the upper educational strata. But mind you, these are only the starting points. After a while, and this is probably what this is not probably, it's certainly occurring right now, that is, it spreads to all the other strata. So in Japan, it could be spreading, or it should be spreading to the higher educated, and in China to the lower educated and more to the more rural populations. So that is a general feature that is also witnessed in Europe, that is the spread across the various social and educational strata. There is also a very clear evidence of cohabitation taking off in Taiwan and in the Philippines, and in a number of other Far Eastern patriarchal societies. We don't have any questions in surveys put to the public, and so we do not know how far cohabitation has advanced. But I will be very, very surprised if all these singles would just remain by themselves or live with their families. I think there could be undocumented cohabitation in places like Hong Kong, and of course also in Singapore, but it's still to be documented. And of course, all of these have very low fertility and have very often period total fertility rates less than 1.5. There's a big, big contrast with the mixed race Latin American and Caribbean populations. They have another layer of cohabitation being added here. That is a strong historical one. Black slaves could not marry. So even if they were freed or emancipated, they stuck to a system of what was called visiting unions. That is, a man would cohabit or would be a visiting partner to the wife's household, and he would only be a visitor for as long as he would contribute financially to that household. So cohabitation, historical patterns of cohabitation were typical for the Black former slave populations. But they also existed among large numbers of Native Americans. They did not have any form of endogamy. In fact, they had to marry outside their own social circles. They had very little arranged marriage, relatively few marriage ceremonies. So as you can see, the institution of marriage was not all that strong. It's actually the Catholic Church, upon the conquest of Latin America and the Caribbean, that introduced a much more stronger monogamous system based on a firm marriage and a church marriage, to be more precise. And the white and the better educated settlers of European origin, they brought, of course, their own Catholic or marriage with them. And so cohabitation among them was regarded as something that was not to be done, was negative sanction against cohabitation. But that has changed dramatically as cohabitation, as there has been a cohabitation boom in Latin America since the 1980s, in the earlier cases, and then subsequently in all the other cases. But what is now typical also for Latin America, that is that the postponement of fertility is not, or did not start all that clearly in the 1980s or the 1990s. And we have to wait until the present day to see the first manifestations of postponement of fertility. And it's an urban phenomenon in a number of countries, and it's also very clearly a phenomenon among the better educated. But for the most cases, and still the majority population in Latin America still has an early cohabitation or marriage formation. But changes are in the making. Then Sub-Saharan Africa, that's an entirely different story. They are still completing their first demographic transition or are in the middle of it. And in Muslim West Africa, it's barely, the fertility transition has barely started, and it's still total fertility rates well above 4 children are still the rule. So there is a lot to be happening in the 21st century there in Sub-Saharan Africa. And moreover, they have a plethora, they have various systems of partnership. There is polygyny, there's the concubines, there's the small houses, so to speak, among the migrants who have a wife at the place of origin and a wife at the place of destination. That is then the small house, the co-wife at the place of destination. And we also see that cohabitation is rising, even among the better educated, not only among the lower classes, but even among the better educated, simply because bright wealth, the the price that the man has to pay to the woman's family, which is the opposite in the Asian case, of course, the price that the bride will that the men would have to pay are very, very high. And as a result, the better educated do not want to do that, and they find cohabitation a cheaper solution for quite a while. So sub-Saharan Africa is a different ball game in many respects. So that's more or less the development on a global scale of what is happening with the bits and pieces of the second demographic transition. Now let's focus for a moment on the link between the SDT and fertility, as there is a double effect. There is postponement associated with the decline of overall fertility, and there is, of course, a counterbalancing phenomenon that is recuperation at a later age. And the degree of recuperation and the degree of postponement together determine what the overall fertility level will be of cohorts by the time that they have completed their procreation. But let's see what is at the postponement side, and I've already pointed out the social and economic constraints linked with continued education, the search for employment or for another better employment, employment security. There is a housing constraint. Housing can be very expensive, and people may want an adequate house before they start having a child. There is, of course, economic uncertainty. And I would even add today, there is also an ecological uncertainty, with younger persons being scared about what the future would bring ecologically, and therefore postpone or even refrain from having a first child. On the SDT side, on the cultural side, there is, of course, the self-actualization that is taking place, and aspirations that need to be fulfilled with respect to leisure, to social advancement, social status, the couple having to know each other psychologically better, something which was not necessarily the case in earlier centuries, and also a need for keeping the future open. Marriage, of course, closes the future. There is a much higher exit cost if you're for divorce subsequent to marriage than to cohabitation. And also a child closes the future entirely. Men can walk out of it, as in some subpopulations, but that is not commonly observed. And of course, motherhood closes the future for women to a much greater extent. That is, of course, also leading into the postponement aspect. Into the recuperation aspect, the gender equity aspect may play a role. And of course, there's a theory, mainly from Scandinavian origin, but also in generally applicable to Western Europe, that is that greater gender equity would lead to a better recuperation and hence to a fertility that is possibly below replacement, but not all that far below replacement and not below 1.5 children. And that, of course, is accompanied by affirmative policies with respect to the gender roles and with the balance between work and the household. And child care allowances, but especially creches, child care facilities, the reduction of opportunity costs of motherhood, everything that works in that particular direction would advance the recuperation, the degree of recuperation that is taking place. And in the balance, of course, that would be playing out together with the postponement to set the overall level of cohort fertility. And that's why I have a suggestion here, that is to make our fertility analysis very specific according to the life cycle. And so I developed then this notion of a life cycle sensitive total fertility rate. So we would be splitting fertility analysis according to 4 classic life cycle phases. One would be teenage fertility. I mean, under current circumstances in advanced societies, this would be an indicator of social class disadvantage, of an incomplete first demographic transition, in fact, with contraceptive failures. Some youth cultures and early would advance that or would cause that. Drugs, very clearly, reduced responsibility would go together hand in hand. And so you would have some early lifestyle experimentation going on. And that could lead to higher teenage fertility. On the whole, teenage fertility is declining. It's very, very low in Northern and Western Europe and also Central and Southern Europe. And it's been dramatically declining from much higher plateaus in the United States, for instance. But now it's coming in the vicinity of the European levels there. And in Asia, teenage fertility is, and especially in the cases we're talking about, teenage fertility is very, very low indeed. In Japan, it's almost non-existent. Due to the fact, of course, that the abortion is also a possibility. The fertility 20 to 29, now that's a crucial one. Here we have the starting phase with every major event in an adult's life. We are having the end of education. We have the start of partnerships and partner selection. The value system becomes much more focused. It's not so much a fluent affair with transitions and insecurities. The experimentation phase is coming to an end. But there's also the question of keeping the future open or of closing it. So all of that plays out in that particular age group, 20 to 29. And that's why we will take that age group as the core of the life cycle sensitive TFR. And then, of course, the next one, 30 to 39, that's the enactment and the consolidation of the options and of the lifestyles that one has been chosen, that were chosen during the previous phase. And that's where, of course, the recuperation of fertility would be taking place. And then, of course, if postponement would have lasted all that long, you would still have an ultimate correction of fertility 40 to 49, but at fecundity levels, which are much, 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 much lower. And this is then, of course, a question of having medical corrections coming into play with fertilization, with assisted fertility corrections being used. So every phase has also its own set of social, economic, and cultural determinants. So also on the determining side, we have to make these distinctions. And so the sensitivity to policy interventions is also specific for each of the 4 classic life cycle phases. And that's why that distinction, these distinctions really matter a lot. And that's why I suggested that we would do the following. We would take the fertility level 20 to 29 at time t as the reference point. So time t would be the link to the timing link in the phenomenon. And then in adding up the other parts, we would take the teenage fertility, but as it existed 5 years earlier. And if that, of course, fertility is already sufficiently advanced over ages, then you would add fertility during the recuperation phases, that is, in the age group 30 to 39, but only 10 years later. That is, you see, we are trying to follow the cohort approach, the longitudinal approach, and fertility 40 to 45 at t plus 15, that is, even another 5 years later. And if we do that, the fertility 15 to 19, 5 years beforehand, 20 to 29, currently, 30 to 39, 10 years later, and 40 to 45, 15 years later, if we add it up like that, we get the life cycle sensitive fertility. And Christoph Seemann at the Vienna Institute of Demography wanted to check out how well we were doing with the life cycle sensitive TFR relative to the actual fully correctly observed cohort total fertility rate. And if you take the classic period total fertility rate and the cohort TFR over all the cases that were documented in their data bank in Vienna, you can really see that the correlation is not all that strong and that there is a tilt in the slope. And as you see here right at the bottom, that the period total fertility rates of 1, the cohort fertility rates are all in the vicinity of 1.5. And that's, of course, the suppressive effect of fertility postponement that was playing. And that is tilting the curve. And that tilt, of course, reflects the tempo bias of the period total fertility rate. But if you use on the right hand side of the slide, if you use the life cycle sensitive TFR, you see that this bias disappears entirely. I mean, the slope is almost the same, and the correlation zooms up, R squared zooms up to above 0.9. So the life cycle sensitive total fertility rate is a very, very good approximation of the actual cohort total fertility rate. And you don't need all the specifics. You can very easily calculate the life cycles sensitive total fertility rate from your matrix of age-specific fertility rates over time. That's as simple as it could be. But of course, we have to be patient, because if we continue watching fertility 20 to 29 and teenage fertility, of course, added to it, until today, we still have to wait for the fertility of those youngsters, of those younger women, to see what will happen with their recuperation phase. And here I've taken three East Asian examples, because we also found the data for Singapore, and I added them in here. You can really see what is happening. The bottom bars, the black ones, and the dark ones are the fertility, accumulated age-specific fertility for those up to the age of 30. And you can really see how in Japan and in Taiwan and in Singapore, they have really been falling. So that is absolutely no news to you. We can also see that the recuperation, that is the lighter gray areas, have slightly been increasing, and in Japan to a real noticeable degree. And this means that, you know, if you sort of visualize it, in Japan, the cohort total fertility rate will remain probably very close to 1.5 children. Only, of course, if the recuperation is also becoming weaker, then that lighter gray area will also shrink. It will not be as large, and it will then follow the declines of fertility witnessed up to age 30. And that is, of course, indicated there by this red arrow. That is, watch it there, 20 to 29 is declining. We would need to have more recuperation taking place now in order to make it to 1.5. But it is still a possibility that Japan will remain well above a cohort fertility above 1 child. In Taiwan, it's much more difficult to say the same. Of course, Taiwanese fertility came down from a much higher level. And so and also teenage fertility was much higher to start with than in Japan, but you can really see the decline in teenage fertility as well. Now, the red arrow here points at continued declining fertility in the age group 20 to 29. Only in the very last years is there a stagnation. And again, how much would the recuperation have to play out? As our statistics become available, we can, of course, fill in the light gray shaded areas. But it's very possible that Taiwan cohort fertility will barely stick out above the 1 child level. And then Singapore is even a more extreme case. Dramatic declines, of course, that's obvious. But if you look at the end part of it, that is during the period after 2006 or 2010, then you can really see that fertility among the youngsters up to age 30 is continuing to decline. It's very low now. And to what degree recuperation will compensate for that is not sure. And it could very well be that cohort fertility in Singapore remains around just above or just below only one child. And in that case, and it's already going on for quite some time, that sub-replacement fertility is manifesting itself, that of course would make Singapore very much more dependent on immigration than it has been in the past, in order to avoid a negative population growth momentum. So that's how, with very simple techniques, with just age-specific fertility rates, over time, one can visually see what things are, how things are unfolding, and one can even speculate visually about what cohort finished, finalized cohort fertility levels could be. I mean, imagine that in Singapore, you would want to go back to 2 children, how enormous the recuperation level will be, and you can really see that this is plainly impossible, and that one should be quite happy if the recuperation remains intact or increases a little bit in order to reach a cohort fertility level of 1 child. Okay, then Zeeman and Sobotka, Thomas Sobotka, my 2 colleagues my 2 colleagues, what is this? It's jumping. It shouldn't be jumping. Oh, come on. This is the one I want. This is the contribution of the parity progression ratios to the decline of fertility in the populations who had a cohort fertility level below 1.75. And there were only, at that time that they started the comparison, there were only a handful of populations. And these authors have taken for Eastern European populations, the 3 German-speaking populations in Europe, which also had low fertility, the Southern Europeans, and 2 cases in Asia, and Singapore happens to be one of them. Now, on the left-hand side, the reddish figure, these are the Eastern European ones: Russia, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and I forget what the other one is. Russia, Belarus. That's the 4th one. The dark red is the loss of fertility due to non-progression to the first child. So that is the impact of childlessness. Cohort childlessness, completed fertility. It's not tempo affected or anything like that. It's really cohort fertility, finished cohort fertility, completed cohort fertility we're looking at. So you can see the contribution of definitive childlessness is a minor one in the overall decline of fertility in these countries. Progression to the second child is the one that really does it. And these are the pink areas below the dark red ones. In the German-speaking areas, there is heterogeneity. In Austria, it is childlessness that is cause number 1. In Switzerland, it's progression to 2 and to 3 children that really caused the decline. And there is no marginal increase in childlessness. And in Germany, it's again an increase in childlessness that is the most important one. If you look at the Southern European ones, Spain and Italy, Spain has the two, a dramatic increase in childlessness plus a lack of progression to the second child. In Italy, the progression to the second and third child is still more or less intact, but it's a progression to child number one, which is the problematic one. And if you then look at Japan and Singapore, with their dramatic declines in fertility, it is, of course, progression to child number one, definitive childlessness, which is the most important one, but progression to the second child remains problematic as well. Also there is a major contribution to the overall fertility decline. So now you can really see how sub-replacement fertility also plays out very differently depending on the parity progression ratios, whether it's mainly an increase in childlessness, like in Southern Europe and Japan and Singapore, and in two of the German-speaking cases, or whether it is mainly a progression to the second child, which is problematic, which is typically the case for Eastern Europe. Okay. Now, the transition to sub-replacement fertility, there are two features here, and they should not be confounded. And I think they have been. And then some of the persons in developing countries who say, no, we are moving to the second demographic transition, or we are close to the second demographic transition starting. I think they to some extent, that idea may be premature. And that is that sub-replacement fertility is not only an indicator of the SDT, it's very clearly also an element at the end of the first demographic transition. And it's the first demographic transition endpoint can be due to sterilization at young ages and much more efficient contraception, but it's also concentrated at younger ages. And they prevent births at higher orders. And they are inspired by probably altruistic concerns of the parents to give the children better chances in life. And that, of course, is an echo of the theory of Arsène Dumont, a Frenchman, in the 1880s, who, and the theory is known as social capillarity theory, that is that the parents invest in the already born children and want to prevent children of higher ranking in order to privilege the earlier born ones. So in that case, it's early fertility schedule and no postponement of birth, and still sub-replacement fertility because progression to 2 and especially to 3 and higher children is being avoided. The SDT is very different. Here there is no early fertility. Instead, it's very, very late fertility, and it's due to very efficient contraception and abortion. And the story is postponement of parenthood, because in the life cycle of adults, there is a phase during which the adults come first with respect to their concerns about everything that matters in life: education, employment, leisure, consumption, aspirations, etc. And the children are only welcome if a number of these objectives are realized. So be careful whenever you see sub-replacement fertility in India or sub-replacement fertility in Bangladesh or in Iran. That does not necessarily mean that these populations are on the brink of the second demographic transition. It means that they are on the left hand side of this slide here, that they are at the end of the first demographic transition, and that that endpoint can easily be sub-replacement fertility. In fact, during the interbellum, between the two world wars, many European populations had sub-replacement fertility as well. It only proved to be temporary, of course. Okay, so that's the fertility part. Now let's look at the cohabitation part, because that's another basic ingredient of the second demographic transition. Without that, it's difficult to speak of a start of the SDT. And there are 3 origins of premarital cohabitation. One is a built-in ethno-historical pattern, and that has nothing to do with the second demographic transition. This has to do with, like in the case of slavery in Latin America, that has to do with historical patterns, and they are very typically ethnically specific. There's a second pattern, and that is that cohabitation is taking the place of marriage because people cannot afford the marriage. That is also, to some extent, a large extent, a Latin American phenomenon, in tandem with the historical pattern. So these layers here are not mutually exclusive. And it has also been observed that in Europe and in Eastern Europe, especially, these patterns of disadvantage are quite important. And also in the US, it has been argued that the pattern of disadvantage is much more important than the second demographic transition one. And the second demographic transition, I mean, this is an articulation of individual autonomy in the partner choice and more gender equality, and not necessarily, and not really a response to poverty or economic hardship. But they are not mutually exclusive. And they can be built as layers on top of one another. For the conclusions of the European cohabitation gradients by education are that the overall rise since the 1980s is much more important than the differences between the social classes and between the educational layers. So that means that there has been a rapid diffusion, even bottom up or top down, bottom up in Eastern Europe, top down in Western Europe, and in Southern Europe. There is a rapid diffusion across all social classes. And that's what I'm, of course, expecting now to happen in China and in Japan as well. So the Western type is the SDT plus the POD, with the SDT leading, and in Eastern European, it's the reverse, but the SDT has now fully has been catching up to almost a full extent. If you look at the Asian cases, this is data for Japan. To the left-hand side, this is for all women, and to the right-hand side, it's relative to women ever in the union or ever married and partners. But so let's look first at the left-hand side for all women, irrespective of marital category. Percentage of ever cohabiting women, 20 to 29, 20 to 24 is a category in which there is still a lot of flux, but from 20 to 29, the pictures become much more fixed. And you can really see in Japan, that was in 2009, the survey in 2009, you can really see that 20% admitted ever cohabiting. 34% moved straight into marriage, only married. But in the cohort preceding them, there were 62 directly married, never cohabiting. And this really catches the profile quite well, but it's distorted by the fact that, of course, in these two age groups, the number of singles who haven't made up their mind whether they're going to sort themselves into the first category or into the second category is still undetermined. Then if you take that effect out, then you can move to the right-hand side and you can look at proportions ever cohabiting among those currently or ever in a union. And then you see that we are over a third already for women 25 to 29 who have ever been in the union. And then this reflects the cohort pattern pretty well. So it came from nothing virtually to 37%. So you really can see how over time cohabitation has been rising in Japan and to quite a clear extent. But there's another Japanese phenomenon, and that is documented here in the far right-hand column, that is the percentage with a premarital pregnancy. I added birth, but it's virtually nothing. So it's predominantly the percentage premarital pregnancies among women who are ever married and who are partners who have a child. What was the proportion premarital pregnancies here? And then there is a real shotgun marriage phenomenon taking place. Large numbers were pregnant before marriage and then hurried into marriage as a shotgun marriages, of course, as a result of that pregnancy. Japan seems to be quite a champion in that respect, but vast changes over the cohorts again. So really, the Japanese situation is not at all a stagnant one. It's one of very profound changes. But one thing that stands out in Japan, that is no birds or very, very few birds occurring outside marriage. In a very nice pattern of using the same data of the 2009 survey in Japan is presented here by James Ramo, and he looked at, according to education, what was the first event? Was it the conception? Was it cohabitation? Or was it marriage? And you can see the conception, junior high school, that was the very first thing, probably followed by shotgun marriage. So then moving then into marriage. But that cohabitation was also a very first movement, a common first step in the pattern among junior high schools. 40% started out with cohabitation. So if you really look at cohabitation and the conception, you can really see there was a lot of premarital sex going on among the junior high school pupils or the ones with levels of education of junior high school. And only a small, or only a quarter of them started out with marriage. With high school, exactly the opposite. More than half of them started out directly with marriage. For vocational training, idem ditto, half of it. Junior college, again, marriage is very clearly the leading one, and the percentages with university are not all that different right here. But cohabitation among university ones as a starting point is already a full quarter. That's as much as high school. 24%, 23%, 24% as well. So you can really see that it is a lower education phenomenon in Japan, that they have the fewest cases moving directly into marriage, that in the higher education, marriage as a first step was in 2009, was still the most common one, but that as a first step, cohabitation was not all that rare anymore among even university educated women. So that's the Japanese case. Now we can also look at the Chinese case, and that has been documented very nicely with the survey of 2014, where Jiayu and my former colleague in Michigan, Yu Xie, produced these results. I've put the values in parentheses for the age group 20 to 24, because many of these women are still in school, and so these figures are too low. Many of them have not yet made their decisions as to what they will do. So this is the percentage of ever cohabitation by education and across the age groups. But if we look at 25 to 29 as a firmer starting point, then you see that cohabitation among the illiterate, and probably these are ethnic minorities are overrepresented here, is very low. I don't know what exactly the story is, but I mean, there are not all that many illiterate women in China anymore. Primary is a firmer point of comparison. A quarter of them ever cohabited with primary school, and it increases. Middle school a bit more, and high school 35, 36%, and it remains close to a third for college educated. So the the starting pattern of the phenomenon in China in 2014 was the opposite from what it is in Japan. It's the higher classes, the higher education groups that started. And the pattern remains like that, an increase, a steady increase for the 30 to 34s, and the maximum, again, high school ones, not primary and middle. 30 to 39, 35, sorry, to 39, idem ditto. It's the better high school and college educated. Here in these older women was the college educated, more than a quarter ever cohabited in China. Now, and then if you move to 40 to 44, then it sort of falls flat, and it's only percentages decrease quite dramatically. So the rise of premarital cohabitation as a period in the life cycle at the beginning of the partnership formation is crucial, because it signals that the individuals are making their own choice. Cohabitation in a patriarchal, the classic patriarchal system, is anathema. It's not done. It violates all the rules of patriarchy. That is that of arranged marriage, of control of marriage by social group, endogamy, a preference for marriage within the same family or within the same larger family, with even cross-cousin marriage taking place. It violates all these things of others poking their nose into the marriage choices of the youngsters. Cohabitation is a very clear mark that these meddling outsiders have no longer a say. That is what cohabitation really means. And that's why I consider it a very major element, even more importantly so than sub-replacement fertility, as a part, as a signal that the second demographic transition is taking place. The Philippines, that's the Philippines. It's a Catholic Asian exception with it, and the survey has only a small proportion of Muslims in the southern Philippines. So it's mainly a Catholic Asian exception. And even there, you can really see, if you take the 2003 and the 2013 results of the DHS, and you standardize by women who are already in the union, that is the B column to the right in the circle, in the square, in the blue set, in the blue square, then you can really see that there is also a gradient, with no education being the lowest and higher education being about the same. And so at the extremes, ever cohabiting is about a quarter, but in the middle, with primary and secondary, and especially secondary, nowadays in 2013, then they're already at 40% and above 30% who have ever, who are currently, sorry, these are data for currently cohabiting women, not ever. So that really means that women with secondary education in the Philippines, cohabitation is almost the rule over being married, and that is that is for women 25 to 29. So for these cohorts, cohabitation is almost at 50%, and it probably, if we would have measurements later on, I would not at all be surprised if women with secondary education have made it to 50% currently cohabiting in the age group 25 to 29 in the Philippines. So again, there you can see, but then the Catholic experience of the Philippines also means that patriarchy was not so strong, and that individual choices can be preponderant. But the Catholic Church, of course, reacted very vigorously against this corruption of marriage, and so the Catholic Church remains strongly opposed to cohabitation. But secularization in the Philippines must very clearly be taking place, otherwise they could not have achieved figures like that in 2030. So there are three conditions for new forms of behavior to develop. A new form of behavior considered here is cohabitation. You must be ready, that is, there must be advantages of cohabitation over marriage. It's lower entry and exit costs. It's a greater partner independence, more egalitarian gender relationships are typical for cohabiting couples. And then the question here is, for the Far Eastern industrial societies, this massive increase in singles, are they really all single? I mean, in Singapore, Gavin Jones and colleagues at NUS have documented that very, very early on, how the singles were taking over from the married. But I have not seen any results yet probing into false singlehood due to cohabitation. So is it underreported? That's, I think, a salient question to ask. Also in Korea, for instance, I don't have any data for that in Korea. So I would be quite curious to see what is happening. Sorry. Willingness is then, of course, the ethical and the religious objections to cohabitation. And so here I think there is an area of exploration, because cohabitation can be part of the ethics revolution, which I will document in a minute. And so that's with respect to the ethics revolution deals with aspects such as divorce, abortion, homosexuality, suicide, increasingly so euthanasia. To what extent is that anathema? To what extent is this an absolute ban on these phenomena? Or versus contrasting with, it depends. You have to look at the circumstances. So a much more lenient, circumstantial evaluation of the procedure. And cohabitation, of course, is a new form of behavior in many, many settings, in Asia, very definitely so. And so to what extent can we glean what could happen with cohabitation in the future if we look at the current state of the ethics revolution? So here we are dealing with a large impact of the religions and historical and dogmatic traditions, gender inequity, etc. And ability, of course, then deals with the legal code and the legal adaptations. To what extent is it banned? I mean, for the moment in Indonesia, for instance, there is talk about co-living, cohabitation, making this entering cohabitation into the penal code, so would be punished, legally punished. It's not that far yet, but it could happen, of course, when the trend moves in the opposite direction and becomes much more strict. So with the ability could become much more lenient, but it could also be much more strict. And that's also a phenomenon to follow. Singapore has been moving towards the more lenient side, and we will see what's happening in Indonesia if it moves in the other direction. I'm not even talking about Afghanistan, of course. I mean, there is a vast regression into the ability, and on every single level, on every single variable here, it's a retrograde phenomenon that is being witnessed there due to religious theocracy. So you really need to have the three conditions together. And that was, of course, what Anthony Cole said with respect to the first fertility transition. Must be ready, willing, and able. But the same applies to any other form of behavior, cohabitation included. And I would invite you to use the same sort of entry, same key to answering the question and formulate it in terms of what are the conditions linked to readiness, what are the conditions linked to willingness, and what are those linked to ability. And then to end it, well, how far have we come with the ethics revolution? And here I have the degree to which extent it is never accepted. So that's the ban, complete ban on any of these 5 features. The data stem from the World Values Survey and from the European Values Survey. And unfortunately, cohabitation was not one of the items. Only these were included. But divorce, for instance, was included. So one could easily imagine that cohabitation would be another one which would be added to the deck. But judging on the basis of these, you can really see here to the right-hand side of the slide, you see Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and the number of Western Europeans, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, and France are very representative for Western Europe and very representative for the Scandinavian countries. You see that there is very little remaining of an absolute ban of people saying no, none of these should be accepted. Oh, incidentally, it's the percentage saying never justified for each of these which are added, and so 5 times 100% makes the scale up to 500. So, and the color bars indicate the percentages for each of the items right here. So it's virtually nobody in Sweden anymore saying it's never justified. Spain and Italy are in a nice contrast for the Southern Europe, because Spain has advanced much further on the second demographic transition, especially with respect to cohabitation than Italy. And it shows very clearly. So Italy is a much more religious, much more conservative society than Spain has been. I mean, the end of the Franco regime meant also the end of the Catholic Church having a major say in matters. And Spain is now a much more secular country. Then the Anglo-Saxon countries of the New Europe, as they're often called, New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, US, and Canada, we have all of them. You can see that they are more conservative than the Western Europeans and the Scandinavians. And USA stands out. I'm surprised the bar is not higher, but they're more conservative, and they were later or fairly late in having the rise of cohabitation. One big exception was the province of Quebec in Canada, which followed exactly the European pattern, but the others were more reluctant. Then Eastern Europe, of course, comes next, and much more conservative. Not the proportions never considering never justified any of these 5 features increase already quite dramatically. But Bulgaria is the most liberal one, and Romania the most conservative one, and it mirrors again in the proportions cohabiting. It's very low in Romania still, and there has been quite an increase over the last 2 decades in Bulgaria. Latin America, more conservative still, but of course they have the advantage of this historical pattern of cohabitation. So their levels of cohabitation are very high, despite the fact that the conservative attitudes prevail with respect to these 5, with the exception of Uruguay, who is the leader in the cohabitation boom. It's just phenomenal, and it's across all educational groups. The university educated women just as high as the ones with less education. Very, very high levels of cohabitation coming in a very, very short period of time. In fact, since the year 2000, there's been a real cohabitation boom in Uruguay, and it's not at all surprising that Uruguay is less conservative than the others right here. Japan, in terms of ethical conservativeness with respect to these things, falls in line with the Anglo-Saxon ones. It's exactly the same level here. And the ones that are standing out is Vietnam and China. They are the 2 countries with the most conservative attitudes. But you can see that in a number of other countries with a Buddhist or a Confucian background, that there is room for increasing cohabitation. I mean, their ethical patterns are quite liberal on the whole. And so I would not at all be surprised to see in the next decade or so that there would be, or already happening, that there would be an increase in cohabitation. At any rate, well, it's time now that in surveys that question should be posed. Are you currently cohabiting, or have you ever cohabited or living together with a partner without being married, or whatever you want to phrase it. And Thailand, with its Buddhist tradition, is very, very lenient in that respect, almost following Japan. And then if you move to the Muslim world, and also the data for India are not shown here. If you move to the Muslim world, there is only one which is much more lenient than the others, and is Malaysia, but all the others are have maintained very conservative attitudes with respect to these five, to homosexuality, abortion, even divorce, euthanasia, suicide. I mean, it's almost for every single case, 90% saying no, this should never be accepted, never cannot be justified at all. So I would imagine that for the Muslim and Hindu populations, cohabitation is not yet on the horizon, except maybe for some exceptional groups in India, some high educational groups in Bombay, in Mumbai, or in some other large urban areas, could be breaking away from classic marriage patterns, and decide entirely on their own who the marriage partner would be, and not even wait for a marriage to cohabit. So, but apart from these exceptional cases, I don't really see that the cohabitation boom is taking place. And so second demographic transition, although they may get to sub-replacement fertility in these countries, second demographic transition is still not materializing on the whole. So I would like to stop right now, as we have already covered quite a bit of ground, and I would leave it to the audience to see if they would have some questions. So I'm giving it all back to the organizers. Thank you very much indeed, especially for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Lasaga, for the fascinating talk. I think that now the floor is open for questions and comments. Like time-wise, I guess we probably limit the Q&A session to 15 minutes. I think we already have a question in the chat box when other people are thinking about your questions. And so this is from Surav Mando. And so like Professor Lasaga, and which is the most prominent characteristic of second demographic transition, or from which we can say that the second demographic transition has started?
Yeah, well, I mean, Singapore, if Singapore will document its proportion cohabitation, then I will include Singapore. But definitely China, and definitely Japan, and maybe the Philippines as well. If they now make it to sub-replacement fertility, then the Philippines would fall into that category as well. That, as far as the Hong Kong probably also, as far as the Asian societies are concerned. But before really putting my finger more firmly on two cases, Singapore and Korea, they will need to have statistics on cohabitation. For the other parts of Asia, this has not been the case. If you'll be looking at Europe, the whole of Europe, and it's very clear, the whole of Northern America, Latin America is now beginning with respect to sub-replacement fertility. So very soon, I think Uruguay is a safe case. There, it has a fertility is below replacement level, and cohabitation, and it's second demographic transition cohabitation, because Uruguayan population is entirely made up of Europeans, former European immigrants. Parts of Brazil, the southern part of Brazil, Argentina, probably are Chile. Not so sure yet, but Argentina is probably making it to the second demographic transition, as well as among the Latin American cases. So it's still in flux. I mean, we're still at an early, relative to Asia and Latin America, we're still in an early phase. And so we have to reserve judgment until the latest statistics are up. But if I would have data for 2020, then I would be able to come up with a firmer conclusion.
So
Then answering the question.
Yeah. I think there's a follow-up question, like how about India? Like where do you think India is?
Oh, it's not the second demographic transition yet. I mean, unless there is cohabitation, as I said, among some specific group somewhere in Mumbai, or unless a very clear indication that individual partner choice is taking over from arranged marriages, for as long as this is not occurring, then India is not yet part of the second demographic transition, although many parts of India will have sub-replacement fertility. But it's that sub-replacement fertility, which I said, would come in at the end of the first fertility transition. No, there is no question about it. India is moving to that stage. And Bangladesh has reached it. I mean, it's very clear. Sub-replacement fertility in Bangladesh is there. And in Iran, it's there as well. And then probably it will be coming in a number of Maghreb countries, or Tunisia could be moving towards sub-replacement fertility as well. But there's no sign of cohabitation. And so that element of the second demographic transition is a crucial one, is missing. And so we are not there yet. The 21st century will be the SDT century for many populations. And we're only in the second decade.
Thank you. We have a question from Chushi.
Thank you very much, Muden. Thank you very much, Professor Lasaga. This is really a great honor to have you here. We all read a lot of your papers. I finally have the chance to have you here to give the presentation. I just have one question, sir. The thing is, in the current literature about STD, actually some of the scholars, try to ask questions like, for the STD theory, so how the theory could tell us the timing and then the skill of the transition. And moreover, STD is a quite comprehensive demographic transition, not only about fertility, but also living arrangement. What will be the mechanisms linking those, transitions together? So with regard to these questions, actually, we are trying to, we have a research team trying to contribute to your theory. I'm seeking for your comments on this. We are trying to use living arrangement projection to see, how STD is valid or not. Because most of the currently empirical study is based on historical data. So how do you think about the demographic projection could play a role in STD field? Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, but the first thing we would need is, of course, an update on data on living arrangements. And current household surveys or part of censuses do not necessarily have the question on cohabitation.
That's true.
And if that is missing, it's very difficult to have good projections by household arrangement. So number one, I think, I don't know if there are any figures for Singapore on cohabitation. I have never seen any.
Yeah.
So number one thing to do in Singapore, the next survey to do is probe how much of these singles, an enormous number of singles in Singapore, up even in the age group 30 to 35, 40s, singles, what's their story? Have they always been just single? It's very difficult to believe. So I'm suspecting that there is quite a bit of hidden cohabitation going on in Singapore. So having a documentation like in China, like in Japan, like in the Philippines, it's necessary to document that. Once we have that, then we are on a much firmer base to move into the multi-state projections by housing arrangement.
Okay.
There are very good examples. Zheng Yi, for instance, has done that for China already way back for his doctoral dissertation for China, and showing, how these living arrangements
Yeah, Professor, Professor Deng is a student.
Right.
We are doing this for you.
So
Yeah, great.
Get the basic figures right. On fertility, no problem. We have the basic figures there.
Great.
But
Thank you so much.
arrangement,
Yeah.
fine-tune them.
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? If not, I guess I will ask a question. And so thank you, Professor Lasaga. Especially I'm fascinated by the idea of this life cycle sensitive TFR is definitely capturing this very diverse nature regarding fertility decisions. And so I'm actually have a question that as you mentioned in the presentation as well, that for example, out of wedlock childbirth is still very rare in Asian countries. And so, but actually, of course, I do not have the data, but there has been some anecdotal evidence showing that there has been a rising prevalence of such fertility behaviors, especially among like highly educated women, as like a way to of self-actualization, right? They have the children for themselves as like individual choice rather than like some familial considerations, carry on the lineage and nothing like that. And so I'm wondering like, how would you think that this change or this shift can be captured and reflected in this life cycle sensitivity of TFR?
If there is a rise of women who have children for themselves and who don't need a partner, then that is very, very much SDT.
Yeah.
That's Scandinavian SDT.
Right.
Very clearly so. I mean, that will be an indicator that the SDT is spreading across all the variables rather than sticking to just one or two. Yeah. And is that the case in Singapore? Can that be documented in surveys?
Yeah, at the time I don't think we have like individual level data,
so.
to reflect that. Yeah.
No. I mean, you can have anecdotal information or seeing it happening around you, but then at that point, be audacious with respect to the questions and add them in. I can refer here now to a Japanese experience. In 2002, I think, we had a seminar in Japan, in Tokyo. And I asked, is there any evidence of cohabitation in Japan? Has this question ever been asked? And the answer was, oh, no, sir. This is a very impolite question. Oh. Well, a couple of years later, a newspaper asked the question in a poll among its readers. And there was cohabitation. And that, of course, then set the demographers working. And then they measured it for the first time in 2009 with an explicit question. And very simply because Professor Arto at that moment was much more interested of comparing Japan to Europe than to another set of less developed Asian nations. And so he adopted parts of the questionnaire that was used in the European set of surveys, and the question of cohabitation was there. And lo and behold, 2009, where the figures I showed, they revealed that indeed cohabitation was a reality in Japan. We need an update, a dramatic update now, because I suspect that it has been spreading not only from among the lower educated, but way upwards. So it's a bottom-up diffusion occurring in Japan. So this is still a story to be documented in Singapore. Where did it start? How did it evolve? How is it linked to socioeconomic status? How is it linked to other surveys? I don't know if Singapore is a participant of the World Values Survey. Because if that would be the case, then you can make a link with the values that I've just connected here to do the story. And that's another important indicator, of course, on the independent side of the theory.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have another question from Professor Jin Yang.
Yes, may I ask a question? Professor Lasaga, thank you for your amazingly rich talk. I have a quick question. when you talked about first demographic transition and second demographic transition, you mentioned that first demographic transition was not an end point and their life after that. Is second demographic transition an end point in itself?
Ooh. We're just starting it. For the moment, in Europe, it seems to stabilize. There is still some growth in cohabitation, but fertility is now has gone down since 2010, despite what my Scandinavian colleagues predicted. That is that equity between men and women, if they're reaching Scandinavian levels, that fertility would increase again. This has not at all materialized in the last decade. So it seems like we're having oscillating fertility around above replacement level, but still at levels between 1.2 and 1.5, 1.6. That seems to be the current situation. Room for cohabitation, yes, in Eastern Europe and yes, in Southern Europe. But Northwestern Europe, the situation is fairly stable. Divorce tends to decline, but of course, if you have more cohabitation, you have less marriage and then you have less divorce. And then the documentation of couples who split after cohabitation that's not registered or not so clearly in evidence. Through the registers, we may find out, but it's an elaborate way of working our way through the data. So there, it seems to be at a much more stable point. What will come afterwards, heavens know. I mean, one thing is also very clear, that is that we are multicultural societies. We have larger and larger influx of people of non-European origin, not even Eastern European, but North African and other Islamic groups moving into Europe. So the multicultural phenomenal picture of Europe, that has not been stable yet. This is still increasing dramatically so. So migration is not caught within the second demographic transition theory, but it is a major player in the system. And so the question is, to what extent will the newcomers adopt the behaviors of the long-standing locals and move into the second demographic transition features as well? In terms of fertility, it's very, very clearly so. They too are moving towards 2 children and even below that. Cohabitation is a tricky business, because if there is intermarriage, for instance, a Moroccan woman and a Belgian or a Dutch or a German man, what happens is that because they may not be directly accepted by either family, one is a secular family and the other one a Muslim one, that they move into cohabitation, and so they avoid the conflict, and they even have children within that cohabiting union, just to avoid the conflict between the 2 cultures. And then only much later on, exactly when the grandchildren are a bit older, or when there are grandchildren, there seems to be then that both sets of grandparents accept the situation, and then there is a marriage. But we found out in the Belgian census that for mixed race or mixed religious couples, cohabitation is a solution. Mm-hmm. So you see how things can work out in a variety of ways.
Yeah. Thank you.
So it's a second demographic transition used as a key to solve a first demographic transition problem.
Wow.
Thank you.
I see there's no further questions, and also I think time is up, and let's put our hands together and thank you, Professor Lasaga, for this wonderful and very rich talk. We have all learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for organizing it, and thank the audience for being so patient.
Yeah, like I believe for many of us, it's like a dream coming true. Like really listen to your talk, not in person, but like in a very realistic way. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
everyone, and hope all will have a good weekend ahead.
Okay, you too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.